Welcome to this overview of consumer and producer surplus as we look at the PDF version of online chapter 4 and the text version of chapter 6, looking at surplus, total surplus, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. So we'll be looking at the meaning of consumer surplus, its relationship to the demand curve. We'll also be looking at producer surplus and its relationship to supply, as well as how to calculate and measure total surplus. We'll also look at kind of a review from the last chapter with elasticity and government controls, the previous chapter before that, in terms of deadweight loss and the impact of elasticity and a tax and the impact that has on consumer and producer surplus. So kind of tying it all together in this chapter on surplus. So let's start by looking at consumer and producer surplus. This is measuring the willingness to pay or buy from a consumer's point of view. How much are you willing to pay for a particular item? That is your consumer surplus. You may not have to spend that much, but it is your willingness to buy. Likewise, a producer surplus is a willingness to sell. In terms of what you would be willing to sell it for. You may not have to because you can sell it for more, but there is a willingness there to sell accordingly. So if we start by taking a look at the textbook example that gives unused textbooks, what Alicia, Brad, Claudia, Darren, and Edwina are willing to pay. Alicia is willing to pay $59 for a textbook. She's probably going to be able to find one. Edwina, on the other hand, is only willing to pay $10 for a used textbook. Probably going to be a little more difficult for Edwina to find something. She may have to make some difficult choices here. But these are good examples of consumer surplus. Our individual willingness to pay, willingness to buy a particular item, and if we were to buy the book for $40, you can see Alicia would have a consumer surplus of $19. If we were selling it at buying it at $40, Brad would have a consumer surplus of $5, and Claudia, Darren, and Edwina would have to make some tough decisions about whether they were willing to buy the book at $40 or whether they were willing to pay more. And so this is the consumer surplus we see here. So the individual surplus is that net gain. Alicia, for instance, willing to pay $59 for a book. At a $40 price tag, her surplus is $19. This is the net gain to an individual buyer from the purchase of a good. It is going to be equal to the difference between what you're willing to pay and the price you actually do. Now, total consumer surplus is essentially adding up all of those individual consumer decisions, all of those individual buying power places, and tallying them up. That's going to give you the total consumer surplus, which is what we see here. The idea of the entire consumer surplus is all of those individual decisions added up together, everything above the price and below the demand curve. Again, I'll say that is above the price because this is the price you're actually paying for the good, and below the demand curve. That is all going to add up to your consumer surplus. So if we look at the price tag in this textbook is actually $30, and at $30, notice Alicia has a consumer surplus of $29 because she's only paying $30 instead of the $40 we had talked about earlier. Now, Brad also has a consumer surplus. He's buying this book for $30. He was willing to pay $45, so he is actually going to have a consumer surplus of $15. And Claudia, $5. Now, Darren and Edwina are still out in terms of their willingness to pay, so they're either going to have to raise their price in terms of what they're willing to pay, or they're going to have to forego the book. So if we were adding total consumer surplus here, we would add up Alicia's $29, Brad's $15, and Claudia's $5, and that would give us $49. So the total consumer surplus here would be $49. Now, if we were to lower the price, all of a sudden the price dropped to $20, all of a sudden there is an additional consumer surplus being added here because the price has fallen. So what Alicia was willing to pay, $59, now she only pays $20. She has a consumer surplus of $39, or an additional consumer surplus of $10. If you add all of these up, you see the additional $35 in this case in terms of what they're all willing to buy. And now Darren can get a book too because he was willing to pay $25. He only has to pay $20. So again, Edwina still unable to buy a book, but everyone else has a consumer surplus in terms of the books they are willing to buy at those particular prices. So an increase in consumer surplus then is this area in which we see additional surplus, additional willingness to buy or pay, and as a result of this, additional consumer surplus in what we are able to buy and what we don't have to spend out of our pocket in order to do so. Now, if we switch over to the idea of producer surplus, this is a willingness to sell. What are they willing to sell it for? They may not have to sell it for that price, but what are they willing to sell it for? This is the producer surplus. And the individual surplus, as we see here, is what Andrew, Betty, Carlos, Donna, and Engelbert are willing to sell their book for. In this case, Andrew's willing to sell it for $5. He is going to love to meet Alicia, who's willing to pay $59. But obviously, you don't know what price other people are paying. This is kind of in their head in terms of what they're willing to pay or willing to sell for in this case. So Andrew is probably going to find a market in his book if he's willing to sell it for $5. Engelbert, on the other hand, going to have a tougher sell in order to find a buyer at $45. Doesn't mean he won't, but it does mean that it is more difficult in terms of making that happen. So the individual producer surplus then is this idea of a willingness to sell and adding up all of the price points at which you were willing to sell it for, but you didn't have to because you got a higher price. So we add that up, and that is the net gain to the seller in terms of the goods they were willing to sell at particular price points. And Andrew is a good example of that. If he's able to sell a book for $30, he has a producer surplus of $25. Now, if we add up all of the different individual producer surpluses, we would get the total producer surplus. This is all of the individual producers adding up their surpluses to get the total producer surplus, which is what we see in total producer surplus or the overall producer surplus. If we see the book being sold for $30, notice Andrew has a significant producer surplus of $25, Betty $15, Carlos $5, and it adds up to a producer surplus of $45. Now Donna wasn't able to sell her book. She's either going to have to lower her price or hope that they raise it. And Engelbert still not finding a buyer for that book at $45. And this we add up all together to get our producer surplus in terms of all of the individual producers and their surpluses in terms of what their willingness to sell was for, but they didn't have to because they sold at a higher price. So if we look together then at these items, what we see is the consumer surplus, essentially everything above the price point and below the demand curve. The producer surplus, everything below the price and above the supply curve. And that gives us our consumer and producer surplus. And this takes us to key graph 25, the consumer and producer surplus that we see here. Again, everything above the price point that you're buying at equilibrium to the demand curve is going to be consumer surplus. Everything from that price down to the supply curve is going to be the producer surplus in that case. And total surplus is adding up all of the consumer and producer surplus, gives us total surplus. Notice it doesn't say total consumer surplus or total producer surplus, it's just total surplus. So adding up the total of the consumer surplus and the total producer surplus is going to give us the total surplus. So what we need to see next here is total surplus. When a tax is implemented, we're going to have some deadweight loss, and we know this is going to be inefficient in the market. But what we're going to see is the role that it plays in reducing total surplus, consumer surplus, and producer surplus, because this is going to have a significant impact. So if a quantity control is put in place, if a tax is implemented, supply curve shift, the idea is the quantity control in place is going to shift a smaller quantity, supply also shifting to a smaller quantity. This creates a deadweight loss. And remember, the deadweight loss is the arrow, essentially the triangle that is pointing to the point of original equilibrium. But all of this used to be part of consumer and producer surplus, or part of total surplus. And now it's deadweight loss, which means consumer surplus has taken a hit, producer surplus has taken a hit, and as a result of this, we have a smaller total surplus as well. And that leads us to this key graph, 26. Notice when the tax is implemented, and this is very similar to the graph we saw earlier when a tax was implemented, supply curve shifts, people are paying P2, The producers are receiving revenue from P3. What we had as a price point at equilibrium in perfect competition was P1. And so both are bearing the burden of this tax fairly equally. But notice consumer surplus and producer surplus are much smaller than they were in the last key graph in 25. Consumer surplus was all the way down to P1, all the way up to the demand curve. Well, now we have inefficiency, we have deadweight loss, we have a tax implemented, and the consumer surplus is much smaller. It has shrunk as a result of this tax being implemented. Same thing with the producer surplus. From the normal producer surplus will be from P1 down to the supply curve, but now with the tax implemented, we have deadweight loss or inefficiency in the market. We have a tax revenue going to Uncle Sam, and the revenue from P3 down to the supply curve is the producer surplus, which is also much smaller than it was before. And that takes us back to this idea of the impact of a tax. It is going to shrink consumer surplus, it's going to shrink producer surplus, and it's going to shrink total surplus as a result of this. Now, let's add in what we talked about in the last chapter in terms of elasticity then. When we see a situation in which one curve is more inelastic or more elastic than the other, that is going to have an impact on the area of efficiency as well as who is bearing the burden of this tax. So if you look at the graph on the left, this is elastic demand. Notice that the consumers have a much more sensitivity to changes in price. So at equilibrium, you notice that the consumer is bearing some burden of this, but it's producers that are going to bear more of this burden because the demand is elastic, very sensitive to changes in price. So in this case, what we see is a big area of inefficiency. I mean, look at the deadweight loss. It's much larger here because demand is elastic. The goods are sensitive to changes in price. But we see that the producer is actually bearing most of the burden. It's much less on consumers because of the concerns that consumers will just walk away because the price point is not there. Now, if we go to the graph on the right here, looking at inelastic demand, if demand is much more inelastic, and supply essentially upward sloping just like it was over here, notice when demand is more inelastic, people are willing to pay more because they have to have the good. It's not perfectly price inelastic, but it is price inelastic. And that means the consumer is going to bear more of that burden. This is a gas tax. This is kind of no sensitivities to changes in price, or a tax on insulin, which would be horrible. What a horrible idea. But the idea here is the burden is going to be borne, or the incidence of the tax is going to be borne by consumers more than producers. And notice the deadweight loss is much smaller here. Why? Because demand is inelastic. If you have to buy the good, then you're going to buy the good. There are some people that won't buy the good, that will try and find a substitute or try and find something to replace it. But the idea behind it is you're going to have less deadweight loss because more people are a slave to the price. They have to buy the good in order to live, in order to get around in their cars. They have to put gas in their cars. And there's only one thing that goes in many cars, and that is gas. Unless it's a hybrid, you're going to pay it. And that's what we see here in terms of the elasticity or the inelasticity in graph B there on the right. Now, notice a couple more here when we look at the idea of deadweight loss. And this is where supply is more elastic. Notice again, the burden is going to be borne more by consumers than producers because supply is more elastic. Many of the suppliers or producers are going to find better resources. This was the goods for pizza that go in, resources that go into making pizza. When supply is more elastic, you're going to see that they're going to try and find ways that they can actually find new resources, find new inputs. Find new flour distributors or producers that can sell them flour at a cheaper price. So you're going to pass along these concerns because supply is so elastic. You're going to pass along some type of a tax like this to consumers because producers will bail. They will find another resource. They're not going to buy that product from you. So your best bet is to try and get the consumer to pay it because the producer clearly won't. They would go somewhere else. Now, if supply is inelastic, what we see here is the deadweight loss is smaller. They're a slave to the price. They have to buy it. So what we're going to see here is the consumer is going to pay part of the tax, but the incidence, the burden of the tax is actually going to be borne more by producers, by the sellers or business owners, again, because supply is more inelastic than demand in these cases. So that leads us back to this key graph 26. When we have a tax revenue that has been imposed, supply curve is shifting from S1 to S2, smaller consumer surplus, we have a deadweight loss, and we have a smaller producer surplus as a result of this. So whether this is a quantity control, we're arbitrarily putting in a quantity control or a price floor or price ceiling, whatever the case may be, or a tax, this is going to change the game in terms of consumer and producer surplus, and that's where we see this borne out in this particular example. What we see here in looking at supply and demand is if we put them together and we look at the demand and supply schedules, where do they meet? Well, when you're looking at this from upward sloping supply curve and downward sloping demand curve, we're trying to find equilibrium. We're trying to find this equilibrium point where we have a market clearing price, we have a sale, and the best place to see that is essentially at $3, and we're going to sell 30 of them. We have it on the supply curve, we have it on the demand schedule and the supply schedule, and so what we see here is at $3 is kind of our price point at equilibrium in terms of what is there. Now, if we look at this at a higher price, if we impose a price floor of $4, we're going to have a smaller demand because the demand is going to drop off at that $4, and we're going to sell 20 of them. But notice the supply, a law of supply says as price goes up, quantity supplied increases. So you're going to have a greater supply, 40 of them offered, and that's going to end up with a surplus. That's going to end up with a surplus in this particular case. Now what happens if we lower the price, if we actually put a price ceiling on this good? What we would find is quantity demanded would be through the roof. We'd have much larger, 50 people demanding this product, but we would have a law of supply says as the price drops, the quantity supplied also drops. So what you have here is only 20 being supplied. You're going to have a shortage, and that's going to cause some chaos in the marketplace. So that's why it's really important to go to equilibrium. Where do we find our equilibrium in terms of quantity and price at those particular points? Now, if we continue, obviously we're going to have even greater shortages in this type of situation, because if you lowered the price ceiling to $1, you're going to have 80 people demanding the product, but only 10 being sold the product. A major gap. You're moving in the wrong direction. Clearly, you're not doing really good work on pricing strategies. And so you would need to raise the price on that in order to get to a point of more equilibrium. So what this tells us is, in a free market, in a perfectly competitive free market, we are constantly pushing towards equilibrium. We are seeing consumers push towards equilibrium. We're seeing producers push towards equilibrium. And the idea here is that we're trying to find the spot at which supply and demand will meet. And that is really critical in these particular instances. So, if we look at consumer and producer surplus, Milton Friedman probably said it best: the most important single central fact about a free market is that no exchange takes place unless both parties benefit. And what we see in this particular space is that this is our equilibrium price. This is our market clearing price. A market has been created. We have no shortages. We have no surpluses. This is the idea that Friedman talks about here in terms of both parties benefiting and mutually gaining from trade in order to do so. So if we look at an example, you want to buy a truck, you go to a dealer, you're willing to spend $20,000, they're willing to sell it for $15,000. After some negotiation, you settle on $18,000. What's the consumer surplus? Well, $2,000. You were willing to pay $20,000, you got it for $18,000. You saved $2,000. And the producer sold it for more than $15,000, so they actually made a producer surplus of $3,000. And this is the voluntary exchange of ideas that we see here time and again in terms of what's playing out here. Now, if we look at calculating consumer and producer surplus, what we see here is consumer surplus. Again, the area is 1/2 base times height. So 20 to 35 would be 15. 15 times 30 is going to give you this 450. And then what we're going to see here is that you're going to take half of that. So essentially you get half of 450, which is 225. Producer surplus, we do the same thing. From 20 to 10 is 10, times 30 is 300. Take half of that because it's a triangle. That would lead us to 150. And that would be $150. Make sure you use the dollar sign. $150 would be the producer surplus that we see here. And then we're going to add them both together to get $375, which would be consumer and producer surplus, which is our total surplus that we see here. So that's how you calculate it. Again, it's just the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height. That's going to give you the consumer and producer surpluses. Add them together to get the total surplus, and you're on your way. Okay, so notice if you're going to implement a quantity control, a quota, you're going to implement a tax, you're going to implement some type of a price floor or price ceiling, you're going to end up with a deadweight loss. You're going to end up with this space of inefficiency. And it is going to reduce consumer surplus, producer surplus, it's going to be inefficient because there are lots of ways that we could be more efficient in the marketplace, selling it at perfect at equilibrium in perfect competition, but we're not able to because of government intervention. So this is where government intervention isn't always a good thing in terms of letting the free market kind of take control of the situation and work out the details. So again, consumer surplus in this example, again, 22 to 18, so that would be 4 times 20 is 80. Take half of that would be 40. $40 would be your consumer surplus. Again, for producer surplus, we're going to take 1/2 base times height, which is 18 minus 16, which is 2, times 20, which is 40. Take half of that, which is 20, because it's a triangle, $20. And then we add them both up to get $60 for our total surplus. And I hope that makes sense. Another activity that is helpful here is looking at deadweight loss. 2-9, activity 2-9, which is in the modules on my MCPS Classroom, is a great resource for looking at what is the willingness to pay and the willingness to sell the consumer and producer surpluses that we see here, and adding them up for total surplus. So I do encourage you to check that out. Some key terms for you to take a look at. If you can't easily define them in your head, probably a good idea to go back and check them to make sure that you know them, so that you have them. Again, vocabulary is so important in economics in terms of speaking the language. Taking one last look at the at your business, if we apply it to businesses, what surpluses are in place that may impact a business today? Think about consumer surpluses. What are people's willingness to buy, especially under coronavirus with quarantine? What is their willingness to buy today? It may be very different than it normally is under normal circumstances. People can't go into malls. They can't shop the way that they have before. They can't go out and spend hours of time on end. It has impacted our willingness to buy in a lot of cases. And so we do more online shopping. Is their willingness to buy online more than that? And what about your business? How does it affect your business in terms of what you might be buying or selling and the impact it would have there? So think about that in terms of how surpluses could impact your business. And again, breaking that down, what would your producer surplus look like? Are you selling at a significantly higher rate in terms of these products in order to make money? What is the consumer's willingness to buy in terms of what they're able to buy here? That would be their consumer surplus. And is there quite a gap between what they're willing to buy and what you're pricing it at? Something to think about in terms of future buying power. How could elasticity of demand impact your ability to do business? How elastic are your products? How elastic is your supply? Not just price elasticity of demand here, but your elasticity of supply in terms of price and price points. And in addition, think about it in terms of what is cross-price elasticity? Are there substitutes out there that could easily take your place? Are there complements that are rising in price that could impact the quantity demanded of the goods that you are selling? These are all important price points that businesses have to take a look at because it impacts their bottom line. It impacts their total revenue, and it impacts their profitability. All right, I hope you found this helpful. Here are the the answers to the take-home quiz study questions that are found in this chapter. And you can pause the video here in order to check that out. I'm also going to show on the screen the answers to the sample questions if you haven't had a chance to take a look at those. they are here, and you can again pause the video in order to look at those. It's important that you you try them and then take a look at them, grade your work, and then come to class with questions that you have on them so that we can help you review for the upcoming test that's coming up very soon. So I hope you found this helpful. Again, be sure to email me with questions if you have them, and if there's any other details that we have left out that we need to include and help you out with, or just break down the barriers, and vocabulary is a great place to start with that. Live the 5. We will see you soon in the next unit, actually, in the next unit, U3, and we look forward to doing that then. Good luck on the upcoming quiz, test, or exam.